The next step in our project is to talk about what atheism is and consider a survey of the arguments and discussions that are currently being had in philosophical circles and to some extent social circles about atheism. So first let me make a distinction that springs from something Antony Flew said in the 70s. Flew distinguished between positive atheism and negative atheism. Positive atheism means something like S, a person, has the belief that God does not exist. What's positive about it is this person is asserting that there is no such thing. So this person has the view that something like that does not exist. So you are probably an atheist about Santa in this sense. You believe there's no such thing. A negative atheist means S merely lacks a belief that God exists. And in this case it would include agnostics and positive atheists. And the idea here is that the A prefix on atheism is functioning in this more traditional sense the way asymmetry, amoral, atypical. In those words, the A means merely lacking something. It doesn't make an assertion about something else being true, it just means that something's absent. So a negative atheist is to describe people as a negative atheist is to merely say that they lack something. So an agnostic in the traditional sense who doesn't believe one way or another lacks theism, so they'd be a negative atheist. And a positive atheist lacks a belief in God, so they'd be a negative atheist as well. This has produced quite a bit of confusion. So we can think about the two different ways, the two different distinctions. Positive atheists assert the claim there is no such thing. So in the classic sense, we divide theists, agnostics, and atheists this way. But on Flew's distinction, a negative atheist would include both what we would have called agnostic and positive atheists. Now, the problem is that very often people in their thinking and in their discussions will slip back and forth between these two senses. And that can produce quite a bit of confusion. We are going to prefer the notion of positive atheists, but let me explain where the confusion comes from. So a negative atheist is merely somebody who lacks a belief, and it's going to include a wide range of people. It would include somebody who's never thought about it, it would include somebody who's suspended judgment because they're not sure, and it would include someone who has thought about it and decided there's no such thing, whereas a positive atheist says there is no such thing. Now, why does this matter? Equivocation is the mistake of slipping back and forth from one definition of a term to another without justification, and when that slippage would make some difference about what's going on in the discussion. So suppose objections to atheism arise and somebody's merely a negative atheist or an agnostic. They say, well, I lack a belief in God. And now what's the burden of proof for somebody who is merely lacking a belief in God? Well, the burden of proof is that person can just say, well, I have yet to be convinced. I haven't heard anything that makes me believe. So I'm still justified in lacking a belief in God. But if someone says there is no God, now the burden of proof is different. That suggests that person should say something like, I have evidence that is sufficient to lead to the reasonable conclusion that there is no such thing in the world. And arguing that there's no such thing out there is different than merely saying, well, I lack a belief and I have yet to be convinced. The burden of proof for being convinced is just, have I heard something that makes me believe? It's just a claim about my own mind. But the burden of proof about the positive claim is to say, out there in the world, there's no such thing out there. So the burden of proof for the positive atheist is much higher than the burden of proof for the negative atheist or the agnostic. And sometimes we hear atheists, prominent atheists in the social movement, will slip back and forth from one sense to the other. So if protests or objections or criticisms come up about their complaint, they'll retreat back to the claim, well, I merely lack a belief in God. You can't possibly find fault in my lacking a belief when if I just say I have yet to be convinced. But look, if they were asserting that there's no such thing, that requires a lot more proof, a lot more justification than merely I have yet to be convinced. One's a claim about your mind, one's a claim about the world. So from here on out, we're going to talk about atheism, and I probably won't add the positive prefix, but what we mean by it is positive atheism. We mean, can there be arguments? What are the arguments? What are positive atheists from the rest of this discussion? Okay, so more distinctions. There are wide and narrow atheists. So an atheist is someone who does not believe in a god or gods. A wide atheist is a person who denies the existence of all gods. So this is the most sweeping, the most comprehensive position. A wide positive atheist would be somebody who says there's none. The supernatural or divine realm is empty. A narrow atheist, however, is someone who denies the existence of a particular conception of God. So there's lots of these around, although people don't like being called the A word. Christians typically are narrow atheists about Allah, for instance, the Muslim God, or about Thor. There's lots of beings about which you are a narrow atheist. Even believers will find some sort of other proposal about a God to be abhorrent or repugnant or contrary to reason or doesn't make sense or think it's not real. Everyone in the room is already a narrow atheist about some gods. You're a narrow atheist about Santa, most likely. Okay, so what else can we say about atheists? Well, for one thing, for the most part, atheists are evidentialists. That is, they take it that whether or not belief in God is reasonable is a function of the evidence that you possess. Now, this wouldn't make much sense. It would be sort of obvious or wouldn't bear mentioning, except for the fact that there are non-evidential faith-based theists out there. There are people who, many people, millions and millions of Americans, for instance, who have faith-based theism. That is to say, many believers have taken the view that belief is epistemically permissible or it's not epistemically culpable when it's a belief that's arrived at through faith. That's to say, even in cases where you don't have enough evidence to show it, or even in cases where you have contrary evidence, it's okay. There's nothing blameworthy about going ahead and believing. So I'm calling that non-evidential theism. There are, however, other people out there, sometimes they get mixed up here, but there are evidentialist theists. We've seen a few of these this semester. Somebody like Swinburne is going to say there is evidence, there are arguments, reasons, empirical data, etc., sufficient to render the belief in God reasonable for a rational person. So there's people who think that we ought to believe in the existence of God on the basis of the evidence, and that's separate from the question about faith. So we've got both evidentialist and non-evidentialist theism floating around out there, where we're understanding faith to mean something like S believes P despite a lack of evidence or despite contrary evidence that otherwise would have rendered belief unreasonable. What we don't find typically is an anti or non-evidentialist atheist. You don't hear of somebody saying, I have faith that there is no God. In fact, that usually raises a lot of laughter in a room full of secular humanists or atheists when I've given a number of talks to those groups. Such a thing seems strange in that case, but I've often wondered, well, look, if it's epistemically permissible to do it in the case of theism, why isn't it epistemically permissible to do it in the case of atheism? But not many people are going for that option. Now, one other difference here between the two is that evidence is prescriptive rationally. That is, when we present somebody with sufficient evidence that shows a conclusion is true, we think they ought to believe, they should believe. For them not to believe would be for them to be culpable. There would be something amiss about that. They should believe when they're confronted with evidence. Faith, however, is a strange sort of thing that way. Faith doesn't have prescription behind it. When one person has faith, that is, they decide to go ahead and believe despite the evidence or despite the lack of evidence, they can't really recommend that to somebody else the way you can recommend it to somebody when you show them evidence that they ought to believe some conclusion. Okay, so there's that asymmetry between the way lots of theist and atheist discussions are unfolding and the way people are thinking about the two. And as we'll see, that's producing some strange asymmetrical problems and teasing and creating some different problems. Okay, so by and large, modern atheists are quite conservative about this notion of epistemic permission. Atheists, like lots of theists, are concerned with rationality and justification. Lots of people worried about that, but atheists typically are more like Clifford in this. They will say believe only those things that are sufficiently justified by the evidence. So they're going to say that you've got to hold back, you've got to withhold, you've got to suspend judgment about those things that aren't sufficiently supported. Now we've seen some reasons, arguments from William James, arguments from Pascal, and we've seen some other examples where people were more permissive about that boundary. But Clifford, of course, argued, well, it's always wrong to believe on the basis of insufficient evidence. So Clifford drew a hard line there, and modern philosophical and not so philosophical atheists in American culture typically are quite sympathetic with that principle from Clifford. They want us to be skeptical. They want to withhold your consent until an adequate burden of proof has been met. And they admonish us, don't believe because you want it to be true, because other people want you to believe, because it would be easier, because it would make you feel better. They want to see evidence, and until it's there, a burden of proof has been met, they're not going to step over. Okay, so what is the disagreement between believers and non-believers? A few distinctions. Atheists often assert that religious claims are unfounded, they're false, they're unjustified, or they're unreasonable. I think to some extent this is unfair. It's not accurate. It certainly doesn't fit with evidentialist theists like Swinburne, who are saying, here's the evidence, here's an argument, here's justification, and this all renders belief in God to be reasonable. So for the atheist to just assert flat out that the view is unfounded or unjustified or unreasonable is to ignore that they've presented an argument. They've presented lots of arguments. Maybe, more strictly speaking, what they want to say is that really, when all of the relevant evidence is considered, it indicates that there is no God. That's what the evidentialist theist ought to be saying. They shouldn't be saying there's no evidence. They ought to say, well, take all of the considerations that are relevant here, including all the things that Swinburne or Craig or someone wants to bring up, and you say put those on the table, and the best reading, the best inference, the most reasonable interpretation of what those are is to conclude there's no God. Whereas, of course, the evidentialist theists will say those all show there is a God. Now, the non-evidential, that is faith-based theists, can agree to some extent with this first assertion from the atheists. They can say, yes, that's right, the evidence is ambiguous, the evidence is insufficient. What they disagree about then is whether or not it's epistemically permissible to go ahead and believe when your evidence is unclear or indicates that X is not true. They're disagreeing, that is, the faith-based theist and the evidentialist atheist are disagreeing about whether or not it's okay to believe in cases where your evidence is not in your favor. So what that shows is that really we've got two disagreements going on here, two very different disagreements, and they're often getting run together. The first one is this one. It's the disagreement over the evidence. So the guy on the left says, well, look, the evidence shows that God is real, and she responds, no, all of the relevant evidence shows that there is no God. So these two are disagreeing about whether or not the relevant evidence indicates God's existence or not, and they've got more or less a straight up standard disagreement about what's the evidence and what does it imply. They're more or less on the same page about the relevance of evidence to the question. So their disagreement is going to boil down to, okay, what does each one of them think the evidence is? Have they shared their evidence? Have they agreed about what all the relevant facts are? And then using the very best methods of inference, the canons of deductive and inductive logic and probability theory and the like, looking at all of that relevant evidence, what is implied by it? So they're having a more or less classic disagreement that maps onto lots of other disagreements we have. But here's a much stranger and a much more interesting and background disagreement that people are also having. So now suppose that we've got the faith-based theist, now the guy on the right, and he says it's okay to believe even if the evidence is unclear or contrary. So this guy's pro-faith. This guy thinks it's okay to go ahead and believe in cases where the evidence is ambiguous. And she says no, like Clifford, if the evidence is unclear or contrary, or we ought to suspend judgment or disbelieve. So now notice that the disagreement between the two on the right is not even about God. It's about this general epistemic policy. It's about what's okay to do when you're not sure. And how should we proceed in cases where our evidence is either running contrary to some conclusion or it's ambiguous. Okay, so very important to keep those two disagreements separated, especially because there is a very common mistake here. There's a fallacy of people switching back and forth. In particular, sometimes theists will switch back and forth from one position to the other. That's to say, it's illegitimate to first argue that the evidence supports God, and then when objections or doubts arise, switch to the faith standard and now assert, oh, well, evidence doesn't matter, I'm going to believe anyway. It's illegitimate in part because evidence or arguments are prescriptive and faith is not. And if we use faith to shore up or to fill gaps or to jump over gaps in the evidence base, we're doing something very different now. And now the atheist and the believer may have a different sort of disagreement. Is it okay to do that? So you don't get to say, yes, the evidence supports the conclusion that God exists, but then when it looks like the evidence doesn't, switch the standard and go, oh, but actually evidence doesn't really matter, I'm going to believe anyway. Or I suppose you can do it, but you can't possibly think that that's going to be a prescriptive position, or that somebody who doesn't do it with you is making a mistake, or they're being unreasonable, or that the atheist who doesn't make a comparable move is somehow irrational for not doing likewise. So moving the goalposts around here for what counts as proof of God or what counts as justification for God, it's a fallacy, and it seems to be quite common when these two disagreements, one about the evidence and one about faith, come up. So it's very important to keep those two clear. Okay, so now to some more general conceptual work here. Where do we stand in the literature amongst experts who've been working on this topic about the prospect of proving the negative? Where do we stand about justifying the conclusion that there is no God? Well, there are two families of arguments here, just like with arguments for theism. There are deductive disproofs, so-called deductive atheology. These are arguments that God is impossible. And there's also inductive disproofs. And underneath each one of these headings, there's a whole variety of different arguments that have been offered by a number of authors in the last, especially 100 years. And we can lump those into single property disproofs and multiple property disproofs. A single property disproof takes a single property that's typically attributed to God, like omnipotence, and is also often thought to be essential to God. So without omnipotence, God's not God. God's got to have omnipotence if God is going to be deserving of the title. And one of these arguments will then argue that omnipotence itself is impossible. We've already seen one of the first little forays into this realm with the argument over, should we understand omnipotence as the power to do anything, or should we understand omnipotence as the power to do anything that's logically possible? That would be to say that this paradox of the stone that we considered earlier in the semester shows that omnipotence A is impossible. So a God omnipotent A, God A, is impossible. That's one way of thinking of the conclusion of that stone paradox discussion. And for the most part, theologians, even theists, philosophical theists, and philosophers of religion have all concurred that omnipotence A is an incoherent property. So that's already been rejected. That's been thrown out for 1,000 years. So that's an example of one of the arguments in this area. There's a number of other arguments. Sometimes people have argued that God can't both be free and omniscient, so some combination of properties is impossible. Another one that commonly gets presented. Theodore Drange has argued for this. He said, well, God is alleged to be infinitely merciful and infinitely just. But look, infinite mercy means that you always give everyone less than what they deserve in terms of moral justice. To be merciful is to take someone who deserves some punishment and to not apply it to the full extent of the law, as it were. But to be infinitely just is to give everyone exactly what they deserve. So infinite mercy and infinite justice, Drange alleges, are incompatible properties, meaning God can't be both of those. Now, we won't settle all of those discussions, but what I need people to understand, what students of this topic should gather, is that there is an active and wide literature here of people having a very live conversation now about whether it even makes sense to apply some of these properties singly or some of these properties doubly to God. Can God be both merciful and justice? Can God be inside of time and outside of time? Can God be the creator and be outside of time? Do these properties even make sense? And there's a number of authors, the deductive atheologists, who are arguing the properties don't make any sense, and without those properties God's not God, so they conclude there is no such thing. Alright, so that's one whole family network of arguments that are being made out there. Another network of arguments out there are the inductive disproofs. These are arguments that God is improbable. And we've already seen some of these. We've seen the problem of evil argument from William Rowe. There's a divine hiddenness argument. There's proof from non-belief. There's scientific naturalism, and so on. And I will summarize a few of these in the slides that are coming up. So two different big families with two different epistemic strategies for showing the same conclusion: there's no God. Okay, now in the favor of inductive arguments, so I'll take the latter one first. Inductive arguments do have this in their favor. We do know that humans are profligate, excessive, eager, overproductive, and imaginative about their gods. Humans come up with way more gods. They postulate far more divine or supernatural or magical entities than can possibly be real. So we know that their error rate is very high. So we're in a background where even if there is a god or gods, we're surrounded by people and a culture and a history that's full of false or mistaken or misguided God claims. Even somebody who thinks that God is real is going to concede the point that there's lots of people out there generating lots and lots of God ideas. They come up with far more ideas of God than can possibly be real. And this adds to the point. Supernaturalism is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. The numbers are staggering here. 30% or so of Americans think that they have been in contact with someone who has died. 20% think they've seen a ghost. 50% of Americans claim to have had a mystical experience. 24% believe in reincarnation. 26% believe in spiritual energy in mountains, trees, or crystals. Those numbers are quite a bit higher in California. 25% of Americans believe in astrology. 38% believe in evil spirit possession, a view that should have gone out of favor in the 1300s. 16% of people believe in the evil eye or hexes. In a recent poll in England, staggering result that is even this big, over 4% of people report believing in werewolves. And not the cute hunky kind like this one, but actual real werewolves. Okay, so we know, I suspect that you would agree that surely not all of this can be right. Maybe you're sympathetic with some of it, but you've got to agree that the error rate here has got to be high. A lot of this can't be correct. If it was correct, we would have some more proof than what we've got. Okay, we also know about all of these guys. This is a mere 500. There are thousands more. These are gods, divine entities, supernatural beings, demons, angels, and other magical creatures that humans have believed in. They weren't dead always. I call them dead now because for the most part, these don't have active believing, genuine followings of people now, but they did at some point or other in history. And probably you would look at this list and you would think, and many of these you haven't thought about before, but my suspicion is that you would look at lots of these and go, yeah, some people believed in those, but I don't think those are real. Okay, so that makes you a narrow atheist about Kupon or Paluga or Sobek or Gefjun or some of these others on this list. Maybe you're a narrow atheist about all of these and a few thousand others, even if you happen to believe in Allah or the Mormon God or in the Christian God or whatever. Okay, now to continue with our summary of the inductive reasons for being an atheist, what else? Well, inductive atheists will say, look, the standard reasons given to justify belief in God are poor. The arguments in favor of God are very bad, and this would at least justify negative atheism on this count. 40% of Americans think that God assisted the evolutionary process to produce humans, and that number is absolutely out of whack with reality. There's no biological, historical, or anthropological evidence that supports this young Earth creationism view. All of the evidence that we have indicates that life on Earth, including humans, was produced by an entirely natural, not supernatural process. There are lots of young Earth creationists out there. 40% of Americans believe that everything was created by God all at once, 10,000 or fewer years ago. But we know from cosmology, astronomy, chemistry, biology, history, anthropology, genetics, and geology that these have been thoroughly and completely refuted. There's no evidence for thinking this is true. Holding this view in the light of the evidence is like believing that the earth is flat or that bubonic plague is caused by demon possession. And rather, I shouldn't say there's no evidence for this view. There are people who have what they take to be evidence. So to be consistent with what I said earlier, there are people that have what they take to be evidence in favor of this. They'll point to the Bible, for instance, as their justification. But we have other information that gives us a better overall explanation of what's going on in this case. And it's saying sort of adamant, exclusionary claims like this that is what makes people think atheists are arrogant, angry, and rude. They have a very bad reputation in American culture for being strident and intolerant. So be it. There's the facts. It would be amiss of us. It would be a grave mistake for us to simply accept the claim that everything was created by God 10,000 years ago when we've got so much counter evidence, so much well-founded evidence that shows the contrary. Okay, now one of the other allegations that often gets made, inductive arguments that gets made in favor of God's existence, are these arguments, and we've seen one of them with William Lane Craig, is that people have alleged, they've argued that God caused the Big Bang. We've seen that there's just not enough evidence to support that conclusion. We don't see any substantial reasons here to think that the cause of the Big Bang needed to be a personal being, an omnipotent being, an omniscient being, certainly not an omnibenevolent being or a personal being. Currently, physics is exploring a variety of physical hypotheses about this, but the sort of classic monotheistic omni-God character is not emerging out of physics as an entity that was responsible for it. Of course, the other major argument, inductive argument in favor of atheism is the problem of evil argument. There's an enormous amount of human and non-human suffering from disease, famine, tsunamis, genocide, torture, and other sources now and in the past. There's more of it that looks completely pointless than we would expect if there were an all-powerful, all-loving God. If there were one of those beings, we wouldn't expect to see so much of it, and we wouldn't expect to see it distributed the way it's distributed. We saw this argument from William Rowe, and many people are convinced by that argument. Of course, now we've seen many authors like Plantinga and Leibniz and Hick who don't accept this argument, but you need to see that this has been an influential argument that has convinced many of the inductive atheists in the philosophical community. So many people conclude that there isn't a God. So that puts them in this kind of position. Here's a guy in the natural realm who's considering a variety of supernatural hypotheses, and he's run through these scenarios. He's considered the fundamentalist Christian God who created the world 10,000 years ago. That doesn't make sense. He rejects that on the basis of scientific evidence. He considers Gefjun, the Norwegian goddess of agriculture. She doesn't seem to fit with the facts. He considers Peluga and elves and chi power and demons and lots of other candidates, and decides these magical, at least these magical or supernatural beings aren't real, so he rejects those. And then he considers some others and adds those to the list. So the fundamentalist creationist view of Allah that some sects of Islam subscribe to, he rejects that because it doesn't fit with the scientific facts. The omnigod, the Big Five omnigod, the B5 omnigod that we've been discussing in the course, he considers that one and decides, well, omnipotence doesn't make sense or what have you. So this guy, on the inductive grounds, is starting to rule out various supernatural hypotheses. Now, does that show there's no God? Perhaps not yet. But he starts to wonder, okay, now I've ruled out all of these candidates, and aren't we getting to the threshold where I can say, are we proving the negative yet? Have we established that there's no such thing? At some point, surely, it becomes reasonable to say, I've considered and reflected on so many of these candidates that and so many of them have got problems that I've decided to reject the whole notion. Okay, so we're going to close the discussion of inductive arguments at that point and consider the highlights, and then we'll move on. All right, so we've now discovered that there are positive and negative atheists. There's wide atheists and narrow atheists. So the most ambitious or the most sweeping form of atheist would be the wide positive atheist. We've seen and we've taken note that there are evidentialist atheists, but there don't appear to be any non-evidentialist or faith-based atheists. I guess we can call those faitheists. And we've also seen, very importantly, that there's two disagreements that are often getting run together. Atheists are disagreeing first with theists over what exactly does the evidence show. And then they're also having this other discussion about, is it okay to ignore the evidence and go ahead and believe? Is faith epistemically permissible? Those are two very different disagreements, and the issues need to be kept separate. And one of them is not really about God, it's about the legitimacy of the faith move. We've seen some of the highlights of inductive atheist arguments. The problem of suffering, naturalistic explanations, the high error rate about gods, and the process of elimination might lead somebody on inductive grounds to think, you know what, I don't think there's some of these, maybe there's none of these at all. So someone's verging on at least getting some conclusions for some forms of narrow atheism on the basis of inductive arguments. And could those inductive arguments suggest wide atheism? And that's what we're going to consider next. What are the deductive arguments for atheism? And that will give us some clues and let us wrap up this larger argument.